दोस्तों, आपको इंडिया के फॉरेन मिनिस्टर एस जयशंकर की ये बातें तो याद ही होगी जो उसने रूस और यूक्रेन के बीच चल रहे युद्ध के बारे में यूरोप से कहा था।
Somewhere Europe has to grow out of the mindset that Europe's problems are the world's problems, but the world's problems are not Europe's problems. That if it is you, it's yours, if it is me, it's ours.
इटली के प्रधानमंत्री जॉर्जिया मेलोनी जब भारत में G20 और राइसिना डायलॉग में आई, तब उसने एस जयशंकर के इस बात को ध्यान में रखते हुए इस पर टिप्पणी की और यूक्रेन युद्ध को सिर्फ यूरोप का प्रॉब्लम नहीं बताया बल्कि वर्ल्ड का प्रॉब्लम बताया। इस पे शशि थरूर ने क्या कहा, चलिए जानते हैं।
The Prime Minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, responded very specifically to that comment, and she said two things that struck home as well. The first was that when the sovereignty of a member state of the United Nations is violated and its borders are crossed over, that's not just Europe's problem. And the second thing she said was that in any case, given the impact of the war on the world, Europe's problems have become the world's problems. And in fact,
यूक्रेन युद्ध के बाद पूरी दुनिया में जो खाद की कमी आई और भारत को सनफ्लावर ऑयल की परेशानियों के बारे में शशि थरूर ने कहा।
In fact, I was digging up some figures on this, and if you look at the extraordinary consequences for the whole world of this war, they've been truly calamitous. I mean, Russia and Ukraine used to export more than 1/3 of the world's wheat and barley, but 70% of our sunflower oil came from Ukraine, as an Indian. We found that about 20 million tons of Ukrainian grain couldn't get out to other countries.
यूक्रेन युद्ध के बाद बहुत सारे देशों में अनाज की कमी और बच्चों को जो परेशानियां हुई खाने में, साथ ही महंगाई के बढ़ने के बारे में शशि थरूर ने कहा कि
And Ukraine and Russia used to export about 6 million tons of agricultural commodities a month to Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. By June of 2022, that number had come down by 4/5. It was a fraction of what it should be. The World Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, FAO, estimated that global food prices rose 20% because of the war. And the consequence is that in places in Africa and elsewhere, the malnourished population is going to be rising from between 7.6 to 13.1 million children who will not have enough to eat because of this blessed war that in theory has nothing to do with them. It's on a different continent, but they're the ones who are also going to be suffering.
यूक्रेन युद्ध के बाद पूरी दुनिया में एक आर्थिक तंगी देखने को मिला, जिसके कारण भारत के भी कुछ पड़ोसी देशों में इसका असर दिखा, जैसे श्रीलंका, पाकिस्तान, अफगानिस्तान। इसके बारे में भी शशि थरूर ने कहा।
You've seen in our own subcontinent the impact on the economies of Sri Lanka, Pakistan, and so on, of the crisis in fuel prices, commodity prices, all of that. So for us to pretend that all of this is something we can afford to ignore is not an option. The war in Europe has affected the rest of the world, and it's hurt the world in very tangible, measurable, quantifiable ways.
शशि थरूर ने एस जयशंकर के बयान को कोट करते हुए चीन और पाकिस्तान के बारे में कहा।
I think what Mr. Jayashankar was alluding to was a slightly different aspect, which is that, say, when India's borders were violated with impunity, whether by our friends in the north from China or whether it was the terrorists coming across the borders from Pakistan, that Europe behaved as if that was India's problem. There was no great solidarity expressed. But when a European border is violated, the expectation seems to be that the rest of the world should be concerned.
शशि थरूर ने इंडिया और रशिया के रिलेशनशिप के बारे में कहा और पास्ट के रिलेशन के बारे में कहा, रशिया के साथ हमारी क्या रिश्ते हैं और इंडिया के न्यूट्रल भूमिका निभाने के क्या क्या कारण हैं, उन सभी के बारे में शशि थरूर ने कहा कि
Why was India reluctant to take a stand against Russia? I'd say there was some practical politics involved. India's had a long relationship with Russia and before that the Soviet Union, which was a strong backer of India on issues that mattered to us. Kashmir at the Security Council, for example. The Russians often protected us against hostile action by other powers. There's a long series of IOUs there. There's a defense relationship. The Russians are prepared to sell us weaponry that the West was not in the 60s and 70s. And so that weaponry now at one point at peak was 85% of all of India's defense equipment. Now it's come down to about 45% because India has been diversifying. We get arms from Israel, America, France, and so on. But the fact is that 45% is still a lot, and what exists needs to be serviced, needs to be repaired, needs maintenance, needs parts. So you don't suddenly disrupt your relationship with a supplier of all those essential things. There's also, of course, importance in terms of imports of some oil, gas, fertilizers, other commodities. So it's a relationship with some substance that India did not want to lightly dismiss by completely taking a hostile stand. That much I can understand.
शशि थरूर ने रशिया और यूक्रेन के युद्ध में भारत की क्या भूमिका है और भारत इस युद्ध को रोकने के लिए क्या क्या प्रयास किया है और क्या कर रहा है, उसके बारे में भी शशि थरूर ने कहा.
But I do believe we could have told the Russians where we stood, and it was interesting that finally Prime Minister Modi in Samarkand said directly in front of the world's cameras, "This is not an era for war, Mr. President," which is as clear a message. And as recently as November, Jaishankar, the foreign minister, was in Moscow, and he kept talking about the vital importance of peace and dialogue and so on. So I'd say that India in its own way is pushing for a solution.
शशि थरूर ने रशिया और इंडिया के रिलेशनशिप के बारे में कहा कि ये रिलेशनशिप फ्यूचर में कहाँ तक जाएगा और इसमें चीन की क्या भूमिका हो जाएगी, ये युद्ध जितना लंबा चलेगा उससे रशिया को क्या नुकसान होने वाला है और इंडिया के लिए क्या ऑप्शन बच जाएगा, इसके बारे में भी, और रिलेशन कहाँ तक रहेगा, इसके बारे में शशि थरूर ने कहा जो आपको सुनना चाहिए.
I think that over time there will certainly be some problems for the Russians. The longer this war goes on, its capacity, for example, to be a reliable supplier of defense equipment, spares, and so on will be degraded. Already, a lot of their military production has been affected by the war. They need to produce things for their own armed forces, whose tanks and artillery and weaponry are being assaulted and bombarded and defeated in many battles with Ukraine. On top of that, you've got the situation where the Russians themselves can't get a lot of essential supplies, semiconductor chips, for example, so essential for manufacturing. With the result that you're in a situation where I'm afraid Russia is becoming more and more dependent on China. And for India, over time, how useful is a friend and partner who is most dependent, or more dependent anyway, on your principal adversary? And China has killed 20 of our soldiers on the borders just 2 years ago. We can't forget that so quickly, 2.5 years ago. So in these circumstances, a Russia that is China dependent, or that looks more and more like a junior partner of China, is much less useful to India than perhaps the Russia.
रशिया से इंडिया को जो ऑयल डिस्काउंट में मिला उसके बारे में भी शशि थरूर ने कहा कि कैसे ये युद्ध के बाद ऑयल की दाम 60% बढ़ गया और उसमें 30% का डिस्काउंट इंडिया के लिए कोई फायदे का मुनाफा नहीं था. इसके बारे में सुनिए क्या.
Meantime, oil and fertilizer sales are continuing. The Russians offer us a discount. It's about 30%. But a 30% discount on oil that's 60% more expensive because of the war is not such a great deal.
शशि थरूर ने यह भी कहा कि कुछ देश हैं जो रशिया और यूक्रेन के युद्ध को खत्म होता हुआ देखना नहीं चाहता है, इससे उनको क्या फ़ायदा है इसके बारे में भी कहा, और रशियन ऑयल को रशिया से ना खरीद कर इंडिया से खरीदने की उनकी डबल स्टैंडर्ड के बारे में भी कहा.
Far from clear that we are going to see a swift end to this nasty conflict. If anything, the worry is that it's going to be prolonged and even more of a stalemate, with these continuing consequences for the rest of the world. So it's with each passing month, it's going to be more urgent for all of us to see this come to an end. But in the meantime, it suits some people's interests to have it continue. I'm sure the arms merchants are singing all the way to the bank, and we've certainly seen some people in Russia doing rather well out of all of this, and we're seeing in some other countries. I mean, I must admit that India is refining a bit of the Russian oil and selling it off to UK and US, and you have to ask yourself, what does that imply? So I think rather than getting adjusted to the new normal, we do need peace, but I don't think the Chinese way forward is.
दोस्तों, ब्रेन रिपेयर एजुकेशन चैनल को बचाने के लिए यह बहुत जरूरी है कि आप हमारे चैनल को जरूर से जरूर करके सब्सक्राइब करें और ज़्यादा से ज़्यादा लोगों को शेयर करें. हमारे लिए यह बहुत ज़रूरी है कि आप हमारे चैनल को लाइक करें और कमेंट जरूर करें. मैं आपके लिए प्रार्थना करता हूं कि आप स्वस्थ रहें, मस्त रहें और आप अपना प्यार और सपोर्ट हमें देते रहें. जय हिंद.